Hello everybody, it's Michael Hollands once again for Sound of the Movies. Today I have the pleasure to be joined by Robert Townson. For decades, Robert Townson has been one of the industry's most respected and prolific producers of film music recordings and concerts, with more than 1,400 albums to his credit. For many years, he has been an important executive at Varese Sarabande Records, and recently he moved on to establish Robert Townson Productions. It is my pleasure to welcome Robert Townson.
Thank you so much, Michael. I'm very happy to be here with you today and always happy to talk about film music.
Great, and thank you so very much for taking the time out of your busy schedule. I really appreciate that. And Robert, at first I would like to know more about your fascination for movies and film music and how it all began back in the day.
Oh my goodness. Well, yeah, many years ago, I was one of the lucky people, or I think a whole generation of people that kind of came to film and came to film music thanks to the films and scores that were being released, being composed and produced in the time period for me that really began kind of in the late 1970s with scores like Star Wars and Superman by John Williams and Star Trek and Alien by Jerry Goldsmith. And then moving, of course, into the 80s and this remarkable time that had so many composers from a previous era still alive and active and writing some of their best material during that time. And it was a great time to be discovering film music. And it really moved me and touched me in a profound way, changed my life, because I found and fell in love with the sound of a symphony orchestra through these film scores, through the great writing of Goldsmith and Williams, and then Elmer Bernstein and Georges Delerue and Alex North, and just a remarkable group of composers that one after another, as I was discovering more of these legendary names, that it further developed my own passions for film music and continued to escalate, where I just developed this voracious appetite for all of the best film music of the day, and then quickly began looking backwards through film music history and discovering the composers of the past, and in large part thanks to the great RCA Classic Film Score series. You know, the recordings that conductor Charles Gerhardt and producer George Korngold produced for RCA back in the 70s. And it was thanks to those that I was introduced to the remarkable genius scores of Erich Wolfgang Korngold and Max Steiner and Miklos Rozsa, Bernard Herrmann and Alfred Newman and Franz Waxman, and incredible history that I was discovering through that series and developing more passion for these other composers. And then again on my own, kind of looking both around and across America in terms of the great film composers, mostly based in Los Angeles, but also internationally at that time, and discovering other great European composers from Philippe Sard and John Barry and I mean just endless. Everybody essentially that, all these legendary names we all know. As a young kid at the time, it was an incredible era of discovery and really finding what became my life's work and passion, all in this really, looking back now, was a condensed period of time, but just so productive and creative to take this work, all of this music that I was falling in love with, and really, in a very short period of time, develop it into what became a career.
You've had a great career as a producer of film music, and you also just mentioned some pretty big names which are of course essential to the history of film music, Jerry Goldsmith, John Williams, Max Steiner and Franz Waxman, and so many others, so many brilliant artists that have given us so much music to remember them by. And film music is such an important element of any movie, and I couldn't agree more with you about the names you picked to describe the grandeur of film music. Robert, please tell me a bit about your label, which was called Masters Film Music back in 1985, and why you established it back then.
Oh, absolutely, yes. Masters Film Music was my first label. I registered and founded that company in October of 1985, and it was in reaction to this growing and developing passion for film music that was becoming so voracious. But at the same time, very quickly, I was discovering that some of the scores that I wanted to buy were not being produced and were not available. And so there was a growing frustration that was resulting in a place in the market, in the world of film music, that I felt wasn't being properly taken care of. And I couldn't believe that there were scores by the giant composers, certainly the people I considered to be the giant and legendary composers, but it wasn't a unique feeling on my part, certainly. It was, these are the composers that the world revered, and my belief was that the scores of Goldsmith and Williams and the others, whether they were attached to a popular film or not, they were still admired and loved and in demand by the world of film music collectors and film music lovers. But during the 1980s, as I said, where there were so many composers from the past that were still active, and then the generation of that time, where Elmer Bernstein was writing so much amazing music, and even attached to big successful movies like, for example, Ghostbusters or Stripes, but they weren't getting soundtrack albums. There would be an album of pop music, or in the case of Stripes, there was nothing at all. Ghostbusters was a predominantly pop album. Same thing for Bill Conti on The Karate Kid. And in the early 1980s, even before those scores, there was the third Omen film that was scored by Jerry Goldsmith. Jerry, of course, did the entire trilogy of Omen movies and won an Oscar for the first one. But the third film, The Final Conflict, extraordinary score, no soundtrack release. John Williams wrote a score in between Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. that was called Heartbeeps. Not a successful movie. It starred Andy Kaufman, Bernadette Peters, about robots. But John was brought into the project because of a connection with the film's producer. And the reality is that our great composers are great composers. Every day they wake up, whether they're working on a great movie or not, they're going to be giving their all. And so the consistency of great scores by composers like Jerry Goldsmith and John Williams and the others is much more frequent than the consistency of great movies being made necessarily. And so when you have all of these incredible composers wanting to remain active and busy and writing as much music as they can, every movie can't be Chinatown or Patton. Every movie isn't, Star Wars or Schindler's List. So they take what is available, and often that results in great scores for movies that maybe aren't quite so legendary or don't age so well over time and whatnot. But we still have these incredible scores. But there were scores that were being composed like The Final Conflict, like John Williams' Heartbeeps. Another was a little movie that Jerry worked on called Raggedy Man that starred Sissy Spacek. And those three scores in particular, The Final Conflict by Jerry, Raggedy Man by Jerry, and The Heartbeeps by John Williams, those became the trio of scores that truly inspired me to start my own label. I felt almost like a calling or a demand that I start my own label because I wanted to take care of these scores and make sure that they were released because I believed that there was a market for these scores and a world and a group of collectors that would want them, but they weren't being produced, they weren't being released. I was very young at the time, just a kid, but decided to not keep waiting around for someone else to release the scores I wanted and not sitting idly by while great film music was being overlooked or ignored. And so I decided, again, just as a kind of a naive kid, to try and do something about it myself, start my own label, and produce the scores that I believed in and felt should be released. Now, even making that plural, as I said, produce the scores, that wasn't so much the concept at the beginning. On the front edge of all of this, the idea was just, well, let me do a single album. And so the whole process of founding my company, creating Masters Film Music, and then connecting with, ultimately, I reached out to Varese Sarabande, which already existed at the time, but wasn't the label, historically speaking, that it became. And this goes back to the mid-1980s. So even, at that time, Varese Sarabande was only 6 or 7 years old. So it was very early in that period. But I connected with them because they were already, even from a kid from Canada, which was where I'm from originally, just outside Toronto, was discovering what they were doing at the time. And they seemed like the world leader in that world. And I knew, even starting a record label, that I would need an infrastructure and a way to release something, because I didn't have an international scope to what I was doing. I would be the production house or label, but I needed a distributor. And so it was for that reason I reached out to Varese Sarabande, connected with them, and then through Varese connected with 20th Century Fox and connected with Jerry Goldsmith, and put together the project that became the very first Masters Film Music Varese Sarabande release of Jerry Goldsmith's The Final Conflict, which was released in April of 1986, so just a few months after starting my label, Masters Film Music. And then that was the beginning, and it did very well. The reviews were wonderful. The excitement over its release, film music fans of the world, the Jerry Goldsmith fans of the world, just went crazy, because it had been 5 years since the Final Conflict film had opened, and there had not been an album. And then all of a sudden, one day out of the blue, here is this album that exists. And so that kind of thing wasn't happening at the time. And so they were very surprised and delighted. Then that began. What a way to start. And my first album with Jerry Goldsmith, the legendary composer. And I can't imagine how anything could have gone any better to really launch what I don't even describe it as a mountain of music. It's a mountain range of music. There's just so many projects over the years and recordings I've been lucky to be involved with, and all the composers I've been able to work with. But to have had it begin with the great Jerry Goldsmith and have The Final Conflict of all scores be my first album and really kick things off, couldn't be happier, and so grateful to all of that, everything, all of the details of this playing out the way they did exactly back in 1985 and 86 that set the stage, laid all the groundwork for everything that followed.
Fantastic. And The Final Conflict is one of my favorite Jerry Goldsmith scores.
Oh, wonderful. Yeah, it's just extraordinary. I mean, the level of writing and the scope and the power, the National Philharmonic Orchestra and a huge choir, and an absolute masterpiece. And still, of course, revered to this day, regularly included on lists of Jerry's greatest scores. Of course, those lists are always very, very long. Another thing that stands out to me whenever I see people making lists of Jerry Goldsmith scores too is the fact that he was so inspired, so consistently excellent, pushed himself so hard to make everything that he released worthy of the name Jerry Goldsmith, that you see an extraordinary range of titles always mentioned when people are, if they're selecting their top 5 or top 10 Jerry Goldsmith scores. It is very rarely the same 5 or 10 scores that get mentioned. You get scores from all different periods and all different movies, because they develop passions for the scores for films often that they love and then that they've been exposed to, and they hear these scores. And so you can have scores like The Swarm or The Final Conflict or Capricorn 1, and all worthy and included on lists of people's favorite Jerry Goldsmith scores, because they are as good as the Planet of the Apes and Pattons and Chinatowns of the world. He never needed a great film to write a great score. And so his entire body of hundreds of scores and television music, it's all extraordinary. He just didn't have bad days. And largely that applies to most of the great composers, but it's particularly true and kind of profound in the case of Goldsmith, because he just pushed himself so hard and worked so frequently. So you have this extraordinary body of work. Even I to this day, haven't heard all of Jerry's music. He was working in radio, he was working in television, he was working in film, and never stopped. He was writing every day of his life. So the world is blessed with this incredible body of work that he pushed himself to create and that flowed out of him so naturally. He was as driven and natural a composer who was happiest when writing music as anyone I've ever met.
Fantastic composer, a genius, a musical genius. And if I were to compile a top 5 or top 10 of Jerry Goldsmith music, it would be a humongous task.
Yeah, and it could probably change the very next day. You could make a top 10 and then say, okay, now let me make another top 10, but not include any of those. You would be able to launch as strong a support of the next tier as you did for the ultimate favorites. It's just extraordinary with him.
Absolutely. But the final conflict will always be in my top 5. That's a fact. And
yeah, fantastic.
And in terms of listening experience, as far as the Omen scores are concerned, I would say the final conflict offers the best listening experience, even though they are all tremendous film scores, because I believe you have to differentiate, a great listening experience. What is a great listening experience as an album, and what is essentially a great film score?
I agree. The creation of an album and the way a score works on album is a unique creation from the way a score works in a film. And writing music that enhances a movie and helps the director tell his story, that's the composer's first job, of course. But in the hands of great composers, film music can do double and triple duty and do more than that and become extraordinary music that stands on its own right, worthy of release on an album, and in more recent years, worthy of being performed by the great symphony orchestra of the world in concert.
Absolutely. And this has been a great development, taking the scores to the concert hall. And there are so many great, film festivals, which we will also talk about a little bit later on. But at first, Robert, I would like to ask you the question, how would you describe the essence of a good film and the corresponding score?
Oh, my goodness. Well, I think the stories that directors tell, that's, of course, what makes a good film. And everybody can have subjective feelings as to what movies and stories really touch you, the individual, an endless and deep well of history of filmmaking. And over that history, of course, we've seen composers of many eras discover or initially, of course, create the world of scoring films. Steiner and Korngold and Newman responsible for the very beginning. And then watching that kind of develop over the years, stylistically, composers finding different ways, but ultimately writing music that helps a director tell the story of their film and convey feelings, emotions, aspects of character, aspects of story, aspects of the soul of a film, all of the elements that are conveyed by a film, and so many elements that cannot be conveyed in any other way but through music, are all contained within the score. And it's a huge responsibility and duty and requirement placed on the composer to write music that does all of these things, and then hopefully also becomes music that will endure and age well, be moving for people beyond the film, but also with an accessibility to it that reaches people as they're experiencing the film for the first time, being guided through the film with certain things illustrated, certain things concealed, all with the aid and with the kind of manipulative hand of the composer guiding them on their way and reaching them both intellectually and emotionally, where it's just a process of, again, being accessible and connecting with an audience in real time, but then writing music that, while doing all of that, also has a deeper side to it and really warrants repeated listenings. And people discover a score, or rather over the course of a film, you have variations from scene to scene of the role of the score, and the job that the composer has to do will change from one scene to another. And there might be a scene where it's mostly dialogue and maybe there's no music at all, or there's another dialogue scene that has certain undercurrent of scoring that's giving you some insights into maybe what is being said can't be taken on its surface or at face value. Or you can have scenes that could be an action scene or a pastoral setting where the composer really becomes the star of a certain sequence in a movie and carries it. Some examples would be like Flight Over Africa in Out of Africa by John Barry, or the Enterprise cue, the introduction of the Enterprise in Star Trek The Motion Picture, or Cleopatra Enters Rome in Alex North's Cleopatra. Those are just 3 examples of endless, where there can be a 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 minute sequence in a movie where the composer is doing all of the heavy lifting, is really taking everything and carrying the drama of the story during that period of time. And then, of course, the scene that would follow, the composer will step back and take on a different role. So the role of music, it changes throughout any given film from one scene to another, and then certainly from one film to another, and then different from era to era and composer to composer. And so it's always changing, always evolving. And there's just variations in the role of music just from story to story, of course, as well. It's part of what keeps film music so exciting and so vital, because there's no singular answer to the question. It's always changing. It's always evolving. It's fascinating to see, even within a composer's work, an interesting aspect. We'll use Goldsmith as an example again. How many action sequences has he scored where, if it's a chase scene, it's sometimes almost literally the same scene from one film to another. It's like, how many chases has Jerry Goldsmith scored? But he would always find a different way, and you would see him challenging himself, saying, okay, well, I've scored how many chase sequences? Now, what can I do that's fresh and new and different in this one? And you would see him meet that challenge and take on the hot water sequence of Outland. And all of a sudden, it's like a movie in 1980, 81, after scoring countless chase sequences in the past, and all of a sudden it's like, here's something completely new, completely fresh, and that's never been done before. And all these years into his career, he's still inventing, and that followed Jerry throughout his life. And that's what makes film music so much fun, because you have composers always pushing themselves, and then the differences of composers, where certain scores, too, that become so iconic to a degree where we really can't imagine them being any different, even any note out of place. We can't imagine any difference in a score like Jaws, for example, that just feels so inevitable, that it's the score that John wrote for that movie is the score that movie had to have, that it couldn't have been any different and been as effective. But the reality is, first of all, that's not true, because until Jaws was written, it hadn't been written. That wasn't the inevitable score. John sat down in front of the film, and one problem and one scene after another he solved, and he solved musically in the way that produced that score. But if Goldsmith had scored Jaws, if Alex North or another composer had scored Jaws, it would have been completely different. We can't even imagine what that would have been. And in some cases, maybe it would have been not as effective. Maybe it would have been as effective. Somehow, we can't even imagine that. But in reality, we become so attached to these particular iconic scores that even hearing an alternate performance of the same piece of music can throw off certain collectors where even if not a note is different, just the variations in the balance between strings and brass, a flute or a clarinet solo or anything, any nuance of difference just becomes foreign to what they expect from a particular score. And so it's fascinating the connections that kind of develop between us and the music we love because it becomes so personal. But it's not, as I say, these scores that we come to believe were inevitable and could not be any different. There was a day before each of them was composed where things could have gone very differently.
Absolutely, very true. And of course, I have seen Jaws at least 15, 20 times. And of course, I feel like I know every frame of this film. And of course, you are right. I'm used to listening to John Williams's iconic music. And who am I to say what the score would have sounded like if, let's say, Jerry had written it, or Alex North, or Elmer Bernstein?
Another kind of famous example is Close Encounters of the Third Kind, the famous 5-note do-do-do-do-do. And that's what we all know. So that is Close Encounters in the mind of every person in the world that has ever seen or heard the Close Encounters music. It immediately connects you to that scene and to that film. Now, John Williams has spoken about how when working towards arriving at those 5 notes, he wrote 200 variations of that melody. And so that's not the only way that could have gone. What if Stephen had reacted to a different set of 5 notes? That would be what we key into and connect with. Sorry, just an example of another case where we can't imagine anything being any different, but there were 200 other variations of 5 notes for Close Encounters. And so what could that have been on another day?
Absolutely, very true. It would be the same. I mean, the same statement can be applied or could be applied to, let's say, actors. Take your favorite movie or any movie which you love, and you see, Tom Hanks or Gregory Peck, or Bruce Willis or Leonardo DiCaprio, and you've seen a film over and over, and you've seen it so many times, you become attached to his or her performance, and you cannot imagine this movie with a different actor. It would be the same with the music.
Yes, exactly. It can go the other way as well, where if there's a performance in particular that we don't like, but we can wonder, it's like, oh, what could this movie have been if only? But again, the variations in filmmaking, every decision is a potential fork in the road that changes everything that follows. That's why when you have filmmaking in the hands of a director, every idea, every casting decision, every person you hire to build the filmmaking team behind a specific movie is so important. The director of photography and, of course, the screenplay, the writers and the composer and the lighting and all of that, in addition, of course, to the actor and actresses and the supporting players and everything. It's this incredible merging of all of the arts. And then, of course, what happens in the world of film fans is people coming to a love of movies from all the different, with particular kind of the disciplines of the arts. Some people are huge fans of photography, and so they key into the cinematographer, director of photography, and music fans key into the score, and actors and actresses are moved in particular by performances. But the great thing about movies is it's this merging or bringing together of all of the arts, and then they're all there on display throughout the course of the film for people to connect with. And it's why I think the world of movies brings together lovers of all of the arts, because all of the arts are involved in filmmaking.
And I always love to say that a film is like a puzzle. You take all these different elements, you put them together, and then what you have at the end of the day is the complete picture, the picture being the finished film. You take the actors, the producers,
Right.
the directors, the composers, the DPs, and the ADs, and everybody who is involved, and people that give it their all to present us the best product they possibly can or could, and that's what filmmaking is all about.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Now I would love to talk a little bit about Varese Sarabande. We had previously talked about masters of film music, and gradually you started working full-time for Varese, and then you became an executive album producer as well. Could you please tell me a bit about those early days when you started working full-time for Varese and how your career developed?
Yes, absolutely. The time period following the final conflict, and of course then on Masters Film Music, the follow-up to the final conflict was Jerry's scores for a movie called Lionheart, which was a Franklin Schaffner-directed film. That was a new film, didn't do particularly well, and was one of those examples of a great score, but for an unsuccessful movie. And that opened up the door to, well, maybe I would not just be doing a single album, but since the first album was so successful, that introduced the idea of, well, maybe I can do more than just one album, and what about maybe keep doing this? And so at that time, it was during the production of Lionheart that I met over the phone and connected with who became my friend, Richard Kraft, who had started working at Varese Sarabande in the time after the final conflict. And so Richard and I met during work on Lionheart. And he ended up being in the position of producer at Varese Sarabande in the time period following the final conflict through Lionheart and into the next year. But it was a short tenure because Richard at heart was a film music agent, and an opportunity to return to agenting came up early in his Varese tenure. And so then that, of course, opened the door when he moved on, that there was a spot to be filled. And I was very happy to do that and continue my co-productions of Masters Film Music, co-productions with Varese Sarabande, but also begin taking on the Varese productions outright, and really had some amazing projects right off the bat. I did it was a blues album for a small film, but a blues album with the legendary Willie Dixon, a very early project, 1989 at Varese, and then also Alan Silvestri's The Abyss. Those were really kind of the beginning of me starting to do projects for Varese. And then that just continued to grow, taking on, for a while, some things that were more they were obvious Varese Sarabande type titles, like A Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and Halloween 5. We're continuing series that, franchises that had history with Varese. But also at that time, one set of recordings I was doing, it was another Masters Film Music series, was Georges Delarue. I was recording 3 volumes of the London sessions with Georges conducting at Abbey Road in London. And so those were also kind of concurrent with that time, recording in 1989. And then those I was preparing for release while working and releasing, as I say, things like Nightmare on Elm Street 5 and Halloween 5. But also then the fall of 89 began a couple pictures that really would prove to be hugely successful and kind of dominate the Academy Awards the following spring, where I did my first album with Elmer Bernstein, a movie called My Left Foot, and also my first album with Hans Zimmer called Driving Miss Daisy. They had a screening of the movie for me. I saw the film and loved Hans's score. But they'd been showing that movie around town to other labels, and nobody was connecting with it, which I couldn't understand. I thought it was a wonderful movie and a beautiful score, and then, my goodness, did that take off and became the Best Picture Oscar winner that year. And then, of course, Hans's career following that, legendary and historic as well. And so after that point, where just the level of success that had been achieved right out of the gate within months of starting to produce for Varese, and including Driving Miss Daisy and My Left Foot, well, that threw the door wide open, taking on more projects. And then by the following summer, the summer of 1990, I ended up working on 7 of the top 11 movies of the summer, including Ghost and Back to the Future 3 and RoboCop 2 and Gremlins 2 and Total Recall and Die Hard 2. Unbelievable summer. Presumed Innocent, John Williams. Ghost became the Varese Sarabande's first and only platinum album, a huge seller. Featured score by Maurice Jarre and Alex North's song Unchained Melody, used so beautifully and so well in the movie. And then all of these other movies that I just mentioned as well were hugely successful. And so after all of that was going on in the summer of 1990, things just never let up. And, moving forward, it was a stunning series of releases and films and scores that just never let up. And I began an average of 50 plus albums a year, so more than an album a week. Yeah, for the next 30 years.
Yes, I mean, you have released a total of, I think, 1,400, if the number is correct, albums throughout your career.
Yeah, a little more. I mean, actually closer to 1,500, but not quite at 1,500 yet. So many happy memories, too, of so many stories. This conversation could go for not just hours or days, but weeks and months on end, because every one of these albums has so many memories and so many stories behind it. Working with the composer and the recording sessions for the project, and all the details that surround all of these things. There are these little time capsules of life where I remember even things that happened in my personal life because of being connected to a certain album, or it reminds me or helps me remember when something happened, because it's much easier to date when a particular movie or album was released. And what you do remember clearly is certain album projects that were going on while something personal might have been going on in your life. And so it's interesting to kind of look back and just remember the connections between albums that so many people, well, really everyone is never aware of, where it's a music supervisor I meet on Halloween 5 that ultimately connects me to Driving Miss Daisy, and all of these things that connect various albums. There's endless associations, both of people and between the movies and albums, and relationships that I would develop with certain film studios and then certain composers. And it's this huge story, multi-layered story behind all of these projects. And of course, the beautiful memories of working with so many wonderful, legendary composers at all stages of their careers, working with the legends and so many legends at the ends of their careers. And of course, there was a lot of that going on in these early years, working on what was John Addison's last score, The Phantom of the Opera, and ultimately what became Georges Delaroux's last score, Rich in Love. Such a beautiful piece. And then at the same time, working on the first album by so many composers, and working with composers like Hans Zimmer and Tom Newman and Elliot Goldenthal, and these A-list composers at the very beginnings of their careers, Alan Silvestri. And so really fascinating to look back now and evaluate and see just what were my instincts like back then, and really thankfully being very comfortable and happy with the way my instincts were guiding me and connecting with certain composers and certain scores. It became, until a movie becomes a hit, you never know what's going to happen. I'll freely admit that I didn't in no way anticipate Ghost to be anywhere near the hit and the blockbuster that became. But on many other pictures, I really did come out of a screening at a point when nobody knows what to expect from the movie, but I was really dead on in my expectation of movies like The Matrix or Babe or The Sixth Sense becoming the hits that they ultimately did and really believed in them. And the scores. And so to have Don Davis's score before anybody had heard it and realizing The Matrix, I thought was going to be something very, very special. And I remember the first time I saw The Sixth Sense, too, what I think is a really pivotal score for James Newton Howard. I remember arriving on the Disney lot to see that movie. I'd be invited to special screenings on lots regularly and some overlapping things and just there was always a lot going on. But in the case of The Sixth Sense, I remember showing up on the Disney lot, and when I got to the gate to enter the lot, I couldn't even remember the name of the film. And so I walked into a screening of The Sixth Sense, not only not knowing that there was any sort of surprise ending or anything about the movie at all. I didn't know the genre. I didn't know anything about it. I couldn't even remember the title of the film as I was entering the lot. And so walked in completely cold to see that movie and was just so struck by wonderful film, the shocking surprise ending, and then the incredible score by James Newton Howard, and another major composer who I was working with so early. So it's nice to see cases where I really believed in a film and a score and be proved right. Of course, all sorts of things happen. There's lots of cases too where I believed in a film and a score and things didn't work out so well. History didn't play out so well for certain movies. That happens as well. But the goal in what I was doing is being as prolific as I was, and also kind of taking seriously the role in the film music community that I was playing, and that was so obvious to me that I was occupying at the time, that it was important for me to be supportive of the composers that I believed in, and not just in the case of cherry picking to a degree of only wanting to work or only standing by them if I felt the movie was going to be successful. I was very comfortable in standing by them throughout the year, whether the movie was going to be successful or not, and really looking at everything with a big picture in mind of course, I need to be kind of fiscally responsible, running the label, releasing scores and soundtracks that support the company. But in doing that, I believe that the best way of doing that was to make sure that the big picture worked, to keep the company making money, but not micromanage that aspect of things to a degree where you could be turning down movies that ultimately become a success as well. But really to, as I say, just take as an important aspect of all of this, a role in the film music community and support the music and composers and release all sorts of scores that, of course, certainly serve film music fans well to make sure there could be releases of soundtracks for movies like Mr. Destiny, a great David Newman score, or Class Action by James Horner, Once Around by James Horner, Elmer Bernstein's Oscar, or Henry Mancini's Switch. Everything didn't need to be City Slickers, an incredible Mark Shaman score that became a great hit. But maybe if there could just be enough kind of City Slickers and Matrixes and Sixth Senses over the course of every year, that kind of becomes the tide that raises all boats and keeps the whole release schedule moving forward and supported. If there could just be enough hits a year, then all good. And that continued really forever. That was the guiding approach that ran Varese Sarabande for the entirety of my relationship with the label. And it always worked. That approach never failed me.
I've got a question concerning the length of an album. Many Varese titles clocked in at just under 30 minutes or 35 minutes, even though it was a UK recorded score. Could you elaborate on that as to why that actually happened?
Well, there two different scenarios could be applied depending on the exact years and particular examples that you might cite. But initially, since I began producing in 1986, that was still an era that involved the release of music on LPs, on vinyl. So the early years of what I was doing, even at a point where if vinyl wasn't still being released in America, vinyl releases of my projects was going on in Europe, so that in order for a vinyl LP to be released, that meant a limitation of 35, 40 minutes of material in order to have the program released on vinyl. So you had that going on, which did limit certain of the late 80s and early 90s scores if they were recorded in the UK. But other than that, the much more dominant reason moving forward the issue wasn't with UK recordings, because essentially, if it had been recorded in the UK, it wasn't restricted by what were called reuse fees. And reuse fees it's a surcharge by the American Musicians Union, where if an album is released of a score, the musicians that performed that score for the film are all paid again, even though they're not performing again, but there's a reuse or a recharge of those recording fees just to release the album. Now, that's the music, the calculations for that are based on the amount of music that's used on the album, and specifically were based on recording sessions. And so there was a 30-minute time limit on using American Musicians Union performances on the release of a score. That was in existence for the entirety of the 1990s. There was no laxing of those rules until the early 2000s. So it's really the 90s that draw all the attention for, well, why were there short 30-minute albums? Well, that's, in a nutshell, that's the reason. Now, any other examples are musical decisions. If it's a score recorded in the UK, for example, Total Recall, the only thing limiting any duration or length is the goal of producing what we felt was the best album possible. And that comes down to, in that case, Jerry Goldsmith and I going through the score and selecting the cues that he wanted, the sequence that those cues might appear in, really producing the album and figuring out how best to represent the score in album form. And that would result in the final selection and sequence on that album. But generally it was, if it's a shorter program, it's because of union restrictions. And then, as I say, in the early 2000s, there was finally some variations to the deal through negotiations that were being had. And that started to change and allow for longer programs and also for certain older scores to be released as well. So that was all a good thing. So many stories going on throughout all of this history that we're kind of breezing through here. But at the very beginning, too, that was really a response to the reality that I kind of landed in after releasing even my second album, The Lionheart Project of Jerry Goldsmith's, where that movie was just not successful at all, but an extraordinary score. What that convinced me of is that, well, there was a market for that music for Jerry Goldsmith fans, absolutely, but there was not a wider market per se that was waiting for a soundtrack for that particular movie based on seeing the movie, because nobody saw the movie. And so we didn't need to put the effort into making sure that that album was sitting in every local CD store at the time, because ultimately they go out to the CD stores and then get returned a few months later because they didn't sell. That's not the kind of mass audience that a score like Lionheart is going to find, but it's going to find a very loving home in the collection of all film music collectors and certainly Jerry Goldsmith fans. And so, yeah, and so that was the idea that inspired me to create what became the Varese Sarabande CD Club. because I wanted to do a series of releases where I didn't have to factor in the issues of something needing to be successful to an overly wide audience or to appeal to the masses, where I could curate a special series of recordings specifically for the film music aficionado. And that's what became the Varese Sarabande CD Club. And then the first releases actually were Three Masters film music titles. CD releases of Jerry Goldsmith's The Boys from Brazil, Roy Budd's score for The Wild Geese, and also a studio recording of what was Jerry Goldsmith's concert program at the time, kind of circa 1988, that I called Jerry Goldsmith's Suites and Themes. And so it was Jerry conducting the Philharmonic Orchestra. And then that was then followed by some outright Varese Club releases. The first of those were Basil Poledouris' Cherry 2000, Miklos Rozsa's Fedora, other things like that. Jerry Goldsmith's The Burbs was also one of the early ones. And that was a series. There was a large hiatus in the club. At a certain point, I was just doing so many regular releases that I didn't have the time. Some years I was up to over 70 albums in a year. And so I just couldn't keep up with also doing a series of Varese CD Club releases. So there was a hiatus, but then it did finally return. And when it did, I was able to then keep up with that and have 2 or 3 or 4 batches of CD Club releases per year, of 2 or 3 titles per batch or so, and maintain that through right up to what became the end.
The Burbs, funny you should mention that. I believe that's my favorite Goldsmith-Joe Dante collaboration, and the film is, I love the movie. I think
Me too.
I think it's hilarious and one of Tom Hanks's early pictures. And the score, that's an expensive one. I think I missed the club release, and I was like, damn, where am I gonna get this the score from now? And I picked it up, and I believe I paid $60 or $80 for it. So that's not chicken feed for a score release, even though it was a release club edition.
Right. And then luckily there was the initial release of The Burbs that I did back in, I think, 1990 or 91, 92 maybe. And then many years later, because it had become so rare, I reissued it and did a Burbs, the deluxe edition. The series I began, again, after the rules of the union and restrictions on CD duration had evolved, that I was able to add more music to certain things and reissue them. And so that became the deluxe edition series of recordings.
It featured great titles. And I also mentioned Predator, which is another case of me watching a movie in my teenage years back then, and fun action movie, an action classic of the 80s even, marvelous score by Alan Silvestri, and there was no CD release.
Yeah, exactly. And Die Hard by Mychael Kamen, same thing. And so that was also the CD Club that rode to the rescue of that one. Huge movies. These were the blockbusters of the time, but no soundtracks were released. Thank goodness we were able to save those. Also, a whole era, too, where along with the issues of scores that had never been released before, I also started a series of new recordings of classic scores from the past, of going to London or Scotland, doing a brand new recording of a great score from the past, of Franz Waxman's Sunset Boulevard, or Bernard Herrmann, Vertigo, or Psycho, or The Trouble with Harry, or Citizen Kane, or Jerry Goldsmith, Patton, and Tora, Elmer Bernstein, To Kill a Mockingbird, all of these great scores. I remember there's certain days where I could finally, after the entirety of film music history, and certainly of my collecting of film music, for example, that there had never been a CD called The Trouble with Harry. Bernard Herrmann's incredible score for Hitchcock's movie never had it. There was never a slot in my CD collection in the middle of my Bernard Herrmann collection that was occupied by The Trouble with Harry. And then one day, all of a sudden, I can slide the next letter T title to the left a little bit and make room for The Trouble with Harry and slide that CD in. It was a wonder to me to all of a sudden literally and physically see history change before my eyes, where all of a sudden it's like many of us store our CDs spines out and lined up like books, and to then all of a sudden see a certain spine join the company of its brothers and sisters on either side of it, the siblings, was moving and exciting to all of a sudden fill these gaps in our collections, both by as I say, new recordings, things like The Trouble with Harry or Sunset Boulevard. I mean, Sunset Boulevard, there's an example where Franz Waxman won an Academy Award for that score in 1950, and there was never a soundtrack release and never a full CD recording of it all those years later, and it wasn't until 52 years after he won the Oscar in 2002 that I finally did the Sunset Boulevard recording with Joel McNeely and the Royal Scottish National Orchestra to finally make that score available. 52 years that took. Just unbelievable. And then all of a sudden, slide the Waxman CDs over and make room for that in the collection, which was so exciting. But also, as I say, things like Die Hard and Predator and all of these things. It was just a wonder of being able to bring them all and serve them up over all those years to my fellow film music fans and collectors around the world. And of course, it's specifically my tastes and intuitions that are guiding the creation of the schedule and what we would release at what period of time. But luckily, my tastes are pretty wide ranging. And so it covered a lot of music, a lot of styles of music, orchestral scores and electronic scores and all kinds of great film music, and then of course spanning all of the eras, and great television music of course as well, from the Young Indiana Jones Chronicles and miniseries like North and South, great Bill Conti score, and CD of Jerry Goldsmith's Masada, masterpiece.
The Right Stuff, Bill Conti as well.
Yeah, an Oscar-winning score, another Oscar-winning score like Sunset Boulevard that did not have a soundtrack release at the time the movie opened. The Right Stuff was 1983, and as we discussed, I didn't begin until 86, so it predated me. And of course, being a huge Bill Conti fan, that was definitely one that I had to go back and make sure we addressed it and got it out there.
The Right Stuff had also been re-released on vinyl, right?
Well, that's been another fun, slightly more recent reality that has befallen the film music and soundtrack world, is the resurgence of vinyl has allowed certain things that absolutely should have been vinyl releases back in the day to ultimately finally get a release on vinyl. Dave Grusin's The Goonies is an example where The Goonies had never had a score release, and I featured that as a special CD Club release and did a release of his music from that score, and then years later was also able to issue that on vinyl as well. And it was so much fun to finally see a vinyl release of The Goonies. And it's a unique, special, historic setting, and very nice to see the larger LP covers that feature the album artwork in such a bigger context. I definitely enjoyed that aspect of being able to bring to vinyl some of those releases that they should have been vinyl releases back in the day, but just never had that opportunity.
Yes, and it's funny how things tend to work out at times. Even though in the 80s, I believe there must have been some kind of demand, people craving the scores. I mean, film music aficionados, they were present in every decade basically, and also the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even the 60s. So I can't believe that there wasn't any demand, for scores like Predator, The Right Stuff, and especially when they're Oscar winning, such as The Right Stuff. So I'm glad they finally were released, even though some have become pretty rare and expensive.
I agree that, there certainly was demand, although it was a different time period too, where the ability and the facilities for film music fans to connect with each other were very different in the 1980s than they are now, with internet and online connection between people around the world and fans around the world, where it was a different time. And so it was maybe harder to isolate the massed voices demanding for a Predator or a Die Hard release back in the 1980s. Even collecting film music has gone through such a metamorphosis over the years and over the decades of, at a fingertip, you can order from Amazon or order from any of the online film music specialty shops. But I remember in the early years having just a few like mail order companies. There was an American company, I can't remember where it was based. It might have been Pennsylvania or something, but there was a company called Nostalgiaphone. I remember getting monthly or quarterly catalogs from them or something that included a little bit of film music news. Sometimes the first I would hear about certain scores would be through a little forum editorial page that they had called the Scoreboard or the Soundtrack or something like that. I can't remember. And then there was a mail order shop in Belgium and a few others. But it was, you really had to kind of do your research and find out how to find some of these international releases. Sometimes something would be only released in Japan, for example. Now, of course, everything is so much more available at a touch. And then the way the community functions in terms of gone from how would people even communicate in the 80s other than like over the telephone or by mail. And then that, as the various eras evolved and all of a sudden things started developing online, and there were message boards or news groups, rather. There were news groups that people could be part of and share opinions, sometimes often belligerent opinions, and just talk film music. And then as things developed, and there were websites and message boards, and then also email developing during that period, and all of these things building toward that we all live in today, but very different. Even what's not really that long ago, but it was a world ago, technologically speaking.
Oh, absolutely true. And I believe, you just mentioned the message boards. I believe that's curse and blessing.
Yes.
You can use them, of course, to obtain valuable information, but I tend to avoid those, because it can be a kind of toxic environment, and I really dislike that.
Yeah, very much. I'll just say I agree with that, and also find that so many of them really become examples of the same 20 or 30 people fighting with each other, or what often devolves into fighting with each other. And so I don't think a particularly instructive or accurate gauge of what's really happening or how people really feel out in the much wider film music world. And so I'm much more moved by the people that either reach out to me personally, and then over time, where now even you got all the things like Facebook and whatnot, where people are actually connected to their own name. So there's a greater responsibility that they have before they say something, or keeping them from saying something crazy, where they just say something from the heart and share their passions for music. And so where I have reacted or acted based on any input, it's been from sources like that. But generally, again, it's a rarity where in the film music world, anything that there's a great demand for, I'm aware of. I've been lucky enough to work with almost everybody composer-wise. I worked with all the film studios, the majors and the independents. And so all the things, to a large degree, anything that hadn't come out or hasn't come out, there's probably a reason. And it's not because I've never had the idea of releasing such and such. Of course, was always a limitation too of I can only do so much stuff every year. And so that spreads out over a period of time as well. My release of Alexandre Spartacus took what to me felt like a lifetime. It certainly spanned the entire breadth of my own career, where in 1990 I promised Alex that I would one day release his score for Spartacus, and I would have and could have never imagined that that would, one, take as long as it did, but also even develop and result in something as grand as it did, because I could never have even imagined the Spartacus box set the way I ultimately produced it at the time of when I was talking with Alex in 1990. But then to release that as what was my personal 1000th CD production in 2010, that also celebrated what would have been Alex North's 100th birthday and was also the 50th anniversary of the film, and really became an industry-wide salute to Alex North and his score for Spartacus, involving so many of the great composers of the day in some way or another, either in the documentary talking about Alex and his importance as a composer and the role of Spartacus in the history of film music, and to have John Williams and Lalo Schifrin and David Newman and Mark Isham and Brian Tyler and Chris Young and myself and Alexandre Desplat, composers from different generations talking about their introduction to Alex and his music and how they feel about that particular score. So that was all in the Spartacus documentary that was part of the box set that I produced. And then there was this extra CD with 22 variations of the Spartacus love theme, and composers like Dave Grusin and Lalo Schifrin and Joel McNeely and John Debney and Brian Tyler and Mark Isham and Randy Edelman and Nathan Barr and so many others doing special arrangements. Diego Navarro did an incredible Spartacus love theme tango, and all of these great composers and my dear friends contributing in that way, doing all of these special arrangements to include on this set, along with then I licensed so many of the classic arrangements of the Spartacus love theme that had been done over the years by the great musicians of each decade, from Bill Evans and Yusuf Lateef and Santana and Ramsey Lewis, and to have all of these performers, along with adding a whole new chapter to the Spartacus love theme legacy, was so important and so moving for me. And then to write a book and have tributes to Alex being written by everyone from Ennio Morricone and Pino Donaggio and John Criliano and Bruce Broughton. And so I loved how that particular production became an international film music celebration of Alex North and his score, showing how important he was really to all of the composers of the world, and all of the great composers who are practicing today all still owe him such a debt. And of course, Jerry Goldsmith would have been part of it had Jerry still been with us at the time I produced that, and same for Elmer. And so we very much miss them, but carried the torch forward and remembered the great Alex North on what would have been his 100th birthday.
Fantastic. Thank you very much for sharing this story with me, Robert. And that goes to show how important Alex North was to the film music community and to the business. And it's so nice to hear these stories, know how other composers, contemporary composers, were influenced by this great artists, and especially by this score. Spartacus is a marvelous piece of work by Alex North.
Very much. And it was so moving for me, because I can tell you that for all the people I was reaching out to and inviting to be part of the Spartacus project, nobody said no. If they got a call from me, it took no time at all. Whether I was asking over the phone or by email, I was getting responses instantly saying, absolutely, it would be an honor to be part of this. Can't wait. Tell me what you want me to do. And that applied to absolutely everyone. It was really beautiful and very moving.
Robert, as you have produced so many albums and expanded releases and deluxe editions, I bet certain or many people, many fans have reached out to you, asking for a certain score. Which score do you believe was or has been the most in-demand one that people really craved and they kept bugging you, please release this score, we really need to hear it?
Well, that has changed completely over the years, because essentially every time I would produce a new one from that list, we would be perpetually chipping away at the list. And so I would probably say up until I did Spartacus, Spartacus was the most requested special edition of anything that I had done. But at the time I did Die Hard, Die Hard was a huge one. At the time I did Predator, Predator was a huge one. At the time I did The Right Stuff, huge. The Goonies was massive. Doing an expanded Back to the Future 3 was a big deal. Then also, again, some of the classics, more historic from earlier eras. Elmer Bernstein's Hawaii, certainly one of my favorites of his scores, and that was a huge deal when I did the 2 CD release of that one. Oh my goodness, so many titles. Even The Omen, doing a deluxe edition of The Omen was a huge deal. It's been an absolute joy and so much fun to bring all of these scores. And again, it keeps changing the equation of what is the most requested score. One of the late ones I did, John Williams' Dracula Deluxe Edition, a huge deal, long requested, so many letters and emails praying for that one day. But a lot of these, the clearing of rights and the finding of tapes and then the work itself, it can be a very long and complex story. And so sometimes it really does take many years for these things to evolve and ultimately get released. Leonard Rosenman's RoboCop 2 Deluxe Edition was another one that took a long time. John Williams' The Cowboys, that was really exciting. Basil's Starship Troopers Deluxe Edition was a big deal that people were really excited about. Bill Conti, the box set of all of the Karate Kid scores, that was something that people didn't even know they could dream of. When that came out, there was like just jaws dropping. They couldn't believe it actually existed. And I hadn't received requests for it because they just couldn't have even imagined that would ever happen. So that's kind of fun where you serve up something that people don't even have the capacity of dreaming for because they can't imagine it. And then one day, all of a sudden, they can order it.
Absolutely. And the Karate Kid, that's a very good example. It's a very expensive box set if you're lucky enough to find it in the first place. Yeah.
The first 3 scores I did individual releases of and reissued them in later years. So that helped a little bit bring that one back into availability. But the box set is pretty rare and unavailable at this point. So I pity the people that missed it, that love it so much. It's hard to keep everything available. The catalog becomes so massive. You can't even imagine the logistics of keeping all of these things in print with all varying rights and deals and all sorts of things.
Absolutely. But who knows what's going to happen? I mean, several scores have been re-released, over the course of the last 10 years. I mean, Predator has had several releases. Back to the Future 1, Commander by James Horner.
Yeah, I debuted that one. Yes, things change and they come back, and who knows what will happen going forward. I mean, I think certainly in a lot of ways getting harder for certain releases. The evolving marketplace and what's happening in the CD world and whatnot, making certain things more difficult. But certainly more will happen, more things will continue coming out, but I'm very grateful for all of the opportunities I've had over the years and to release things that certainly fulfilled so many dreams of my own, as well as, I think, and hopefully other collectors. The Alfred Hitchcock Hour series of releases, I loved working on those. It included so much music of Bernard Herrmann's and also Lynn Murray and Lalo Schifrin and the Bernard Herrmann at 20th Century Fox 14 CD box set, and Jerry Goldsmith at Fox, a special production that I did for Jerry's 75th birthday, and that actually turned out to be the last CD that I was able to give Jerry in person. And remember so clearly the day I was able to take that to his home. Actually, Richard Kraft and I went there together and give that to Jerry and just sit with him as he went through the booklet and was looking at all of the individual films and the liner notes and photos that I included in the booklet. And it was bringing back memories of his, and he would tell stories of this movie or that movie. And very touching. And then he got to the page where we talked about his prologue music from The Agony and the Ecstasy, the Michelangelo picture. And he was so happy to see that. He said, "Oh, fantastic, you included the prologue from The Agony and the Ecstasy." And I said, "Yes, Jerry, I'm so excited about that too. I love that score. It's one of my absolute favorite pieces of yours." And he smiled ear to ear and looked at me and he said, "Mine too." Just so touching, and such a great visit with him that day. And he was so happy to hear that the announcement of the box set had been so successful, and that his fans really gathered around that release and snapped up all the copies so quickly. And so that made him so happy that his fans remembered him. I'm so glad and so grateful that we were able to complete that in time and to give him what it's the most elaborate release of the entire Goldsmith discography, a 6 CD box set like that. He had never had anything like that. And so I'm so glad that we completed it and were able to give it to him just a couple months before we lost him. Not a day that goes by where I don't think of him and remember him so fondly and miss him so much. As I often say, after we did The Final Conflict, there was never a time when Jerry and I weren't working on something new. And so that continued right up until what was his last score, Looney Tunes Back in Action, and then beyond, doing continued various editions of things that had never been out, and then deluxe editions. So great to release things like The Red Pony, his Emmy-winning score, The List of Adrian Messenger, and Lonely Are the Brave, and so many of these great scores. One he was very excited about that he was around to see was Studs Lonergan. And I remember when he knew that I was working on Studs Lonergan, every time we would have a conversation, he would ask, "So when's Studs Lonergan coming out?" He just couldn't wait for that one to get released. And so it was fun because he really cared about the scores that he really remembered fondly. It was important to him to get them released. And so he was very happy to be involved and see things like that happen, including the expanded Total Recall that I did, the deluxe edition of that. Yeah, he was very much a part of that and very excited that we were able to do that as well. So much fun, but of course the other side of that is invariably at the point when we lost Jerry, since we were always working on so many things concurrently and going forward, that there was a huge pile of things that Jerry and I were planning that we just never got to. Hopefully, certain of them, some of the recordings, I hope I'll still get to in some way. But there's no replacing having Jerry on the podium. And some of the projects that we were planning, I really lament because it's not possible to do them without him. And then others, hopefully, we will be able to. But always miss him. He was so dear and such a great role model and inspiration and friend.
Yes, I mean, Jerry Goldsmith, for many people, he was the greatest film composer of all time. I cherish his work. He's in my personal top 5 easily, in the top 5 of the greatest film composers ever. So many masterpieces, so many great scores, so much innovation, you know. And I believe he wrote the best action cues. Of course, no disrespect to any other composer.
Yeah, I know what you're saying. Yeah.
Jerry wrote the best action scores, and Total Recall, perhaps maybe his best action score of all time. I don't know if you share this feeling.
I do, and one thing I'll add too is just saying, I think part of what you react to in Jerry's music and in the ways that it reaches out and touches people, his music really is indicative of the man himself. And the invention and creation and spirit in the music is partially a result of the fact that he loved being a composer. He was driven. He loved music. He loved that he could write music. He loved pushing himself and writing better music. In interviews, when asked even of his own work, what might be his favorite score, his answer was always, and it was a genuine response, he said, "I'd like to think that I haven't written it yet." He would begin every new project with the hope that it could be his best or take him in a new direction and do something new. And that kept him always moving forward, always reinventing himself. You're always seeing Jerry's music evolve, and people react to different eras. Sometimes maybe they prefer the 50s television music. Maybe they prefer the 60s scores or the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, all of these eras, but it's always Jerry. You always have the artistic thread that connects these scores, even when they are wildly disparate, that they have musically nothing to do with each other. But if you listen to Planet of the Apes and then you listen to A Patch of Blue, they couldn't be more different, but at the same time, neither one of them could be by anyone other than Jerry Goldsmith. They are connected by a thread that makes them both unmistakably Jerry Goldsmith. And then, of course, you can add in endless numbers of other scores in there as well, where the range is phenomenal. But there is an artistic vision and a sensibility to his writing that makes it unmistakably a Jerry Goldsmith score. And so it's so fascinating to see that manifest itself in all of these different works, all of these different styles in action and drama and science fiction and Americana and all of these genres of filmmaking and types of stories. But he loved being a composer. He loved being a film composer. He loved telling stories with his music. And he put so much effort and love and drive into the work, into the music that he wrote. And it comes out. We hear all of that. We hear his intellect. We hear his emotions. We hear his passion and his artistry and his artistic drive in all of these scores. And I think that inspires and drives so many of us in so many ways.
The range was absolutely fantastic and also incomparable almost. You had,
yes, I agree.
You had The Wind and the Lion, Chinatown, Pavillon, The Ghost and the Darkness, and First Blood.
Oh, I love that score, First Blood. My goodness. Who else but Jerry Goldsmith would write the guitar and trumpet main title for First Blood? Just period. The way he captured the loneliness of John Rambo as he walks into town for the first time at the beginning of that story and launches the franchise. And it's so beautiful and so profound and so moving. The Sum of All Fears, where he writes a Latin hymn to peace for soloist and orchestra over the main title sequence against a fighter jet on a bombing run with a nuclear payload. But he writes something that takes a much larger, broader role in this story and a much more profound comment by the composer that transforms the scene.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. That was a fabulous piece of music for one of his latter scores. I think that was the early 2000s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, maybe 2000, 2001, 2000, something like that. It was his, I think, third or fourth last score.
Yes, fantastic one to boot. And speaking of musical innovation, thematic material, the industry has changed quite a bit. If you closely examine today's work and put it up against, the scores 20 years ago, 30 years ago, even 40 years ago, where do you, Robert, see or find the biggest change if you were to scrutinize the whole evolution and development?
Wow. Well, of course, every aspect of film music continues to change. With the passing of time, of course, even the individuals involved in film music, the composers who write it and the directors who hire the composers who write it, it all continues to change, and styles of writing continue to change. The technology behind recording, we're now even in a period where you can't even put an orchestra together in a room and record them because of the COVID-19 situation. And so But the creativity, where the demands of film scoring have maintained that they still exist, and so composers have been recording their scores. It's called remote recording, and so they're recording musicians individually, with the musician performing in their own homes with microphones and interfaces and programs capturing all of this. And so the technology, thankfully, at this point, it exists where that can be done, and is being done astonishingly, kind of unbelievably well to a certain degree. I think there's a limitation on the size of orchestra, really, and the types of orchestration that can really be recorded this way. Particularly for television, it's been a good solution. There have been less examples so far of full, large-scale film scores, or even full-scale symphony orchestra television scores being recorded via remote recording. It's not that it can't be done, it's just it becomes, the larger it gets, the more complicated it becomes. And of course, you can't get around it being always best to record a symphony orchestra with an orchestra sitting together, making music together with colleagues, hearing their section friends in the flutes or clarinets or strings, hearing what they're doing and kind of dovetailing and merging their performances together. And there's all sorts of magic that goes on in the studio. Simply can't be had when you're all recording from home. But technology is always evolving, and certain situations and things continue pushing the world of film music in anticipated and unexpected directions and ways. So we see everything continually changing. Another big evolution we're going through is, I guess we could call it the fall of the CD. There's certainly fewer CDs being released these days than ever before, and it's getting harder and harder to release or justify even releasing CDs for a lot of things. I'm very much a supporter of the CD and love releasing my recordings on CDs, as well as, of course, making them available digitally. But some companies are electing to go solely digital at this point. Many companies, actually. And so that's another seismic shift in the way of marketing and making film music available that has been going on. It's tough to imagine the next stage of things. We will all kind of discover that together. Thankfully, I've got still many ideas of recordings that I'd like to do, and also really love taking advantage of the opportunity of presenting film music live in concert. That's been another particularly contemporary shift in things, even though film music in concert, it's not a brand new thing, but it's how widely it has been embraced now. The scale and scope of it all has definitely changed. Film music in concert used to really involve John Williams, Jerry Goldsmith, Henry Mancini, and that was it, with the ability to present on any sort of regular basis film music in concert. And in more recent years, the opportunity of film music festivals developing, and then thereby inspiring other orchestras to start programming more film music by, I think, festivals like Tenerife and Krakow and Vienna and Ghent, the level of productions that they present showing great film music being performed live, and then the reaction of audiences going absolutely crazy. So much enthusiasm and love for these programs has had an effect on other symphony orchestras that used to look at film music as foreign or beneath them, separating themselves from even the idea or notion of including film music in their programs. But as times change, and again, personnel, even in the classical world of symphony orchestra managers and music directors and artistic directors, you have a new generation of them being introduced into the world and coming onto the scene. And maybe this current and particularly the next generation of artistic and music directors are even coming to classical music through perhaps discovering classical music the way I did, which was actually following my discovery of film music. It was first Goldsmith and Williams, and then Dvorak and Sibelius and Beethoven. And that's how I discovered classical music. So I think by having artistic directors of symphony orchestras and whatnot maybe also finding their way into classical music via the same series and sequence of events, you can't get around the fact that film music is so prominent. People see movies and people hear scores, and there are so many famous composers now. They are touched and affected by those scores, and they are finally realizing that, oh my goodness, there is extraordinary music being written for films. And certainly historically, there has been so much great music written for films. And then we've seen specifically, it's made me so happy to see the increased resonance and renaissance of the music of Erich Wolfgang Korngold in recent years, where such a variety of his film scores as well as his concert works are now fully embraced and being programmed regularly into the programs of the great classical orchestras of the world. His operas are being performed like never before. Not just Die Tote Stadt, but also Violante and Das Wunder der Hellion. And so it's a broader, widening net of acceptance that is growing. And I think or hope that we will see the next generation of composers that are welcomed into the great classical halls of the world be composers like Bernard Herrmann and Alex North, and then hopefully Jerry Goldsmith. These works absolutely deserve to be performed. And hopefully that will continue. And certainly I will continue to push as much as I can and program all of these composers whenever possible. I love creating programs. I love also when creating concept programs behind a certain show, for example. I love reaching out to some of my composer friends and giving them an opportunity of reinventing a particular score of their own in a concert setting, or for them to reimagine the great score of a composer that they also revere, a composer that we each love. Doing a special concert version of that is a great opportunity of adding to the repertoire and taking film music into another new direction that doesn't even then rely on exactly the way it was written for the film. But I love the concert setting to give the composer an opportunity of taking the music maybe in a new direction, maybe developing it more where they might have had a certain scene change or whatnot that limited the development of a certain melody in the movie, but maybe they get to expand on that and flesh it out more in the concert version. And so for me, presenting film music in concert is in no way limited to just porting a cue from a film to the concert stage and playing it that way. That's certain scenes, certain cues, like the Enterprise from Star Trek, for example, or Ride of the Cossacks from Taras Bulba. These are standalone set concert pieces that come from a film score that play astoundingly well, absolutely brilliantly in a concert setting. But I like taking things, most of all, even in a new direction and allowing for the creation of an all-new repertoire that is inspired by great film music, but definitely taking advantage of the opportunity of there not being a restriction to only performing it the way we heard it in the film, and creating new concert works inspired by film scores or melodies incorporated or drawn from a film score. An example of that would be what Lee Holdridge did with Alex North's Spartacus love theme, which was not part of the box set, but was done later for a concert, where he took Alex North's Spartacus love theme and did a special arrangement as a fantasy for flute and orchestra, arranging the piece for the flutist Sarah Andon and creating a piece, again, based on Alex North's Spartacus love theme, but really becoming a movement of a concerto. I love that sort of inspiration that results in all new concert works that really reinvent and reimagine things in ways that maybe even the original composer would not have. But it's a great way for artists and composers of different eras even to kind of collaborate and work together and see what might be created for certain soloists or certain orchestras. I always say the beauty of film music and the reality is that film music isn't any kind of music. It's all kinds of music. And there is an endless well of great music and great music that works in film and works in concert, and an endless source of creativity coming from our composers of today and tomorrow.
Film music concerts and festivals are so important as they, of course, show the significance of film music, not only in terms of, it being an art form, but hopefully we can also attract a new audience, and maybe people will even perceive film music differently within or without the context of the film itself. And I feel it's very important to promote these events, and I hope we will have plenty more in the future.
Yes, I hope so too. I love doing this. I love presenting film music in concert. I create programs. I work with all of the big festivals, commissioning my composer friends to do special pieces, and I'm inviting various of them to attend and be part of the different festivals. It's great fun and also so very important, I think.
Absolutely. And let's see how film music will, be perceived in the future and how it will be developed. And of course, every decade, has seen progress and development, for better or worse. I mean, I have rewatched a couple of movies of the 80s. The film music has changed. Many people perceive that the thematic content isn't as strong as it used to be. I don't know how you feel about that, but I certainly believe that there is a lack of emotion, not generally speaking, and I believe they would have been scored differently 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, I do agree that that is certainly the case in certain cases. No question about it. At the same time, we've always got to be wary of the fact that when we look back, of course, we remember the great examples. The standout scores are the ones we remember. When we're looking at contemporary times, we're seeing everything. And so we don't have the benefit of hindsight when we're looking contemporaneously, concurrently with all the new music that's being created. So there is that side of things to just keep in mind where, okay, if we look back at today from 5 years in the future, what we're going to remember are the best scores of the last 5 years, the standouts. And so if it's John Powell's How to Train Your Dragon and something by Alexandre Desplat and something from Patrick Doyle and, the best scores of theirs of the time, these great composers, Marco Beltrami's Snowpiercer, plus the ones we just mentioned, Patrick's Cinderella. And so we could still do a great concert of great music from film. It's just you cherry pick, and that's the way it's done. When we look back, it's only the best ones we remember. We don't go back to 1980 or 1990 or 1970 and look at the weaker scores of that year. Those have already been forgotten. And so that's why all of the eras from the past look particularly rose-tinted glasses, as we say. It shines up the past because it's only the best that we remember. But when we're only looking at current days, we're seeing everything released and thinking, boy, we sometimes have to go a ways between great scores. And so maybe they're a little rarer still today. I could maybe concede that. But thankfully, we definitely have great scores still being written, and it remains such a vital and exciting art form. All the composers that I mentioned and so many others, Chris Young and David Newman and Thomas Newman and Randy Newman and Brian Tyler, and incredible to see the range of music, and then the wondering, for all of us, kind of what the next chapter will bring. Who will be the standout composers? Who is the next Desplat? Who is the next Giacchino that maybe scores a video game and all of a sudden gets so much attention and then scores a film and breaks through? Mychael was such a sudden, brilliant story of his emergence on the scene. Brian Tyler was also pretty sudden. Let's hope stories like that will continue to happen. And we'll see where the next great composer comes from.
Absolutely. You never know what's waiting around the corner. And of course, I remember the early days of Michael Giacchino when he was still, composing, for video games, and then all of a sudden, like you just mentioned, he became a huge film composer.
Yeah, all of a sudden, one day, there's The Incredibles, and it's a game changer. And it's fascinating. In the world of film, you can have a particular score change someone's life, change the world of film music in an instant. Years ago, Jerry Goldsmith said, kind of driving around, and on came A Streetcar Named Desire of Alex North. And he heard that and thought, oh, he had to stop and just couldn't believe that film music has changed. It will never be the same. In that one score, Alex introduced jazz into film and brought with that a whole new American sensibility to a world that had been dominated by European composers previously and European musical styles. And all of a sudden, here's this new, fresh, jazz-influenced sound of America in a score. And sure enough, it changed film music forever.
Absolutely. That's also a very important score, and The Streetcar Named Desire remains one of my favorites of that era, and very, very good effort. And
yes,
the re-recording is also very, very good, I must point out.
Thank you. That was a wonderful couple days to be able to record A Streetcar Named Desire with Jerry Goldsmith conducting the National Philharmonic Orchestra. Just remarkable, and was such an important score to both Jerry and I, and of course everyone. Just so special.
If I may ask, is there any favorite Jerry Goldsmith story or moment you would like to share with me and our audience?
Oh, I've shared so many. I mean, he was such a huge inspiration in my life. What I was able to record with him, every day I went into the studio with him, I knew was making music history. From the new film scores being recorded to when we would do a new recording of either his own film music or of Alex North's music. I mean, one of my favorite recordings that I got to do with Jerry in Scotland was an album called Jerry Goldsmith Frontiers, with him conducting a collection of his great science fiction scores from Star Trek and Logan's Run and Capricorn 1 and The Illustrated Man and Alien and others. And recording that album, it was like attending a private Jerry Goldsmith concert where we would record a piece and get that done, and Jerry would call me in the booth, and he said, what do you want to do next? I'd look at my schedule, and I'd call out, well, what about, let's do Logan's Run. He said, okay. Call out to the orchestra, Logan's Run, and get the players to bring up the music on their stands. And so many great memories with him. I love being in Scotland or London with him. We traveled there so many times to do either recordings with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra, or also we did a birthday concert tour with Jerry celebrating his 70th birthday. And we did 3 shows around Scotland with the RSNO, and also finished up in London at the Barbican with the LSO. Having time in a different time zone than from where we both lived, of course, which is Los Angeles, and to have that kind of separation. This is back before email certainly existed, but it was not the online lives of everyone. And so if somebody wanted us, they would have to call. It was even before the cell phone era, so they would call our hotel and leave a message if they needed to reach us, which means to just be out and around town, we were inaccessible to the normal kind of demands and things always happening in Los Angeles that would be going on for each of us. And so it was just such a nice time to be able to be separated from that, and then also be together just hanging out, enjoying each other's company and talking about music and talking about life and just being. And so those are definitely some of my happiest memories of Jerry, just being off somewhere in the world. As I say, more often than not, it was Scotland or London. Being there to make music, that's what our lives were about. But also just having the time together and traveling together and having fun together. I love that and miss that. He was so much a part of what made film music fun for me. And then when we lost him, I was really concerned because he had been that all my life, all the time of being a film music producer. I really wondered and had concerns of if it would all still be as much fun for me afterwards. There was a period of time where I just kind of had second thoughts and wondered, well, do I continue? Is it still going to be fun? Am I still going to have the drive to keep producing recordings and keep producing concerts? And of course, I realized the answer to that was yes. It would be different. I would always miss him. I miss him more than ever these days because how much it would have meant to him, the legendary level he would occupy if he was still around today, and he would be like 91 years old right now. If he was able to be traveling, he never would have retired. So if he was 91 and still had his health, he would be still doing recordings, he would be writing new scores, he would be traveling for concerts. And the idea of being able to include him and go off to Krakow or Tenerife, oh my goodness, I can't even imagine how thrilling that would be, obviously for them, for the festivals themselves, for the audiences that would get to experience that, for Jerry because he loved performing and he loved bringing his music to people. He loved the concert experience. And so I miss that and miss him in that regard, but it stayed exciting and fun for me in that I love sharing music that I have a passion for, also with audiences and fellow fans around the world. I have always had so many ideas of things that should be recorded and need to be recorded and how to record them and all the things that I do. And so the ideas don't stop. And every album I do, also, I would say the album releases are still as exciting as my very first albums, because every new album I release is one I've never released before, with ideas I've never presented before. And an example of that is my most recent album, my most recent recording, which is called Cinema Morricone, available on Sony Classical, which is my new association, collaboration between Robert Townson Productions and Sony Classical, and it takes Ennio Morricone's music and presents it in special arrangements for flute and piano, and the flutist is Sarah Andon and the pianist is Simone Pedroni. The program arranged by Simone with pieces that I selected and came up with the concept of the album and invited both of the players to be part of it. And then we recorded this 2 CD set of special arrangements of Morricone's film scores, really striving to kind of capture the details of the orchestration, but again, reinvent them and place it in the hands of these two virtuoso musicians and make it a very intimate presentation, but to take on not just the love themes from these scores and make it a collection of beautiful themes from great Morricone scores. There's an endless supply of those. We could be recording that forever. But to take on the full orchestral pieces with very complex orchestrations, and the finale of The Mission with orchestra and choir, or Al Capone, the jazz stylings of that from The Untouchables, and the westerns from Once Upon a Time in the West, Once Upon a Time in America, the sprawling dramatic saga of that story. But to take a real deep dive into Morricone and present much larger suites, and then other pieces where it's just a theme from a particular score, Playing Love from The Legend of 1900, one of my favorite scores of his, and present it again in this intimate setting for flute and piano, and then release it on Sony Classical, opening up again, presenting a recording to a new audience and a new generation, hearing Morricone in a new way. And so that was very exciting for me, and I certainly have more ideas in that regard, and in all ways, because still I love film music leaning towards classical. I love film music in an orchestral setting, and I love film music in smaller, intimate ensembles of duets and trios. I love jazz film music. I love big band jazz film music, and I've done concerts and recordings in all of these different styles and more. So things continue in that world, and that again fuels me and keeps me going in the years since losing Jerry, as I say, where I always remember him and miss him, but I also have more new Jerry Goldsmith ideas of recordings that I hope to do, and absolutely included him in the special concerts that I was able to present with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra much more recently, just in November of 2018. So it was kind of the finale of the Varese Sarabande years. And we staged the Varese Sarabande 40th anniversary gala with the Royal Scottish National Orchestra and special guests. Composers Rachel Portman and Patrick Doyle and David Arnold were all there. Diego Navarro was a conductor and also included a piece of his own in the program, so beautiful. And we had some great soloists, Sofia Troncaso, great soprano, and Sarah Andon on flute. And we did amazing shows. My beloved Royal Scottish National Orchestra, so many happy memories of all of my past years and trips to Glasgow and Edinburgh working with that orchestra. So it was a great reunion with them, with their still players involved with the orchestra that were part of those recordings. So that was very nice to see them and the musicians that remembered me. And Jerry was absolutely included and featured in that program. We did Alien, we did Patton, a little Air Force One, a little Basic Instinct. So very exciting and moving to have Jerry, who they, particularly the musicians in the orchestra, remembered having the opportunity of performing for him live, which is an opportunity they revere even more these days, looking back, that they can't believe they got to record for Jerry Goldsmith in Glasgow and to then play his music again all these years later in concert. That it was a great moment and really, really exciting concert, and so many special memories came flooding back for me. There could not have been a grander, more beautiful finale of the Varese years as what that proved to be, celebrating the 40th anniversary of the label and looking back over all those years and so many friendships and relationships amongst the composers over those years.
And I'm looking forward to your new projects. And we just talked about Robert Townson Productions, which you established in 2019, late 2018?
Yes. It started establishing in late 2018, fully up and running into 19, and released the Morricone album with Sony in the spring of last year. And of course, we had so many activities planned for this year that have just been scuttled by current events. We had more recitals and recordings and whatnot. So that's all on hiatus for the time being, but will return as soon as it's possible. And I can't wait for that. I'm definitely chomping at the bit to get back in the saddle and present more concerts of all scale, as I say, recitals and full orchestral shows and new recordings.
Right. So you will continue to promote concerts and also give us, more CD releases in the future, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. Nothing is at an end. It's all just a redirection of kind of a refocus of activities. So Varese Sarabande, no longer the source, the home of my recording and production activities, that moves on. But Varese for all those years was me working with so many amazing composers, and moving forward, I'm still me, and we'll be working with composers and musicians, and the story goes on. It's a great adventure in music that I love and will always be my life.
You mentioned the Cinema Morricone, which was a great project. Are you at liberty to already disclose which project you have mapped out already, CD-wise?
No, unfortunately not. I've never done that. Until something is ready to release, I never release it, because things can happen. And of course, look at what has happened this year. We could have never imagined what has happened. Even the things that were what seemed imminent, absolutely imminent a couple months ago, are now delayed beyond what I can't even guess. None of us know what's going to happen.
None of us would have ever expected anything of this kind. Of course, I hope we will overcome the whole, terrible situation. But I'm sure it will be fine in a couple of months, at least. That's what I hope. And maybe
yeah,
that's...
here's hoping.
Yeah, maybe
certainly in some amount of time.
Yeah, maybe it's just wishful thinking on my part, but I'm a, the glass is half full person, so...
Yeah. No, I've no doubt that things will return. On what time frame, I have no clear vision. So much of what I do, of course, It's sad, but I think the world most negatively, or certainly amongst the worlds that are most negatively affected by all of this, is the artistic world, and certainly performance and music, because it relies not only of audiences coming together, and you're, of course, concerned over the safety of an audience, but even the idea of putting an orchestra on stage and sitting players next to each other and having wind players blowing into their instruments or choirs singing. It's all inconceivable at this point. You can't do any of that. And so it's been such a total shutdown of that whole world. It's really been surreal to see everything come to such a halt. And so far and away, my deepest concerns are for the world and institutions and musicians that are being so dramatically affected by all of this and put in a situation that just could not have even been imagined until the sudden realization of this absolutely bizarre disease.
And of course, a huge financial loss as well. I mean, just imagine the whole film productions, being put on hold and the theaters are closed.
Yeah, everyone is hurting. The pain is so widespread. It's film productions and what it's doing to the studios and movie theaters, concert venues and orchestras and musicians and all of these empty venues and stalled productions and everything. I mean, we can't even conceive of all of the cost of all of this as spread over everyone, every orchestra in America, every orchestra around the world that all of a sudden could not perform anymore. And then all of the complexities of all of the deals with the performance venues, the great symphony halls of the world. Well, what happens to them? They have real estate costs and responsibilities, and their buildings aren't being used. Well, then what happens? And on and on. It is very serious, and as I say, certainly I'm so concerned with how this affects the world at large and in terms of those performances and just getting hopefully everybody back in one piece and moving forward. I don't want to see anything come to an end. Sadly, I'm sure there will be some things that just aren't able to resume. We're not able to see what those might end up being yet.
Let's hope for the best. Robert, is there anything else you would like to add?
I think we've covered a lot. I mean, there's, as I say, every album has so many stories and memories behind it. There's no end to the stories I can tell about the great people I've been able to work with over all of these years. We can, pick up on this at another time and continue. But I think we've covered a lot for today, and I've really, really enjoyed speaking with you.
Great. Robert, thanks again for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you. I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly.
Thank you so much, Michael.